larva needs. And it may go into kind of a C-shaped hardened larva and wait out. So most of these things only have one generation per year. They're univolting. Now there are some bees that will go through 2 or 3 generations per year, but in general, these solitary bees are single generation per year. So the bee that you see going to a cactus blossom and nesting this year overwinters as this larva. Other species will overwinter as a pupa or even an adult. So it really can't come up with one generalization for that. Bees will typically, they have lots and lots of diverse architecture, but typically there's a main burrow or shaft with little side lateral tunnels going off of that. And then the cell can be vertically oriented or horizontal. And then there's always that little plug. And the females may backfill the burrows completely, or they might leave them open. I think Ed mentioned from some slides in his garden that, you know, you see a hole. Desert Museum produced a book on holes in the desert, right? Kind of a little field guide. Well, if you look at these, what happens is that if you think about taking like a drill, a battery-operated drill, and just going around and drilling holes, if they're perfectly smooth and round, chances are it's a bee nest. If they're ragged and it has a tumulus or a little sand pile around it, it could be ants or something else. In this case, some of the bees have little cones, look like little volcanoes. But again, the hole for a bee is typically round. You have a lot of parasites. Marguerite showed these two bee flies, and I'll be talking about these a bit later. So bees are the unsung heroines of pollination. The most common bee that is recognized around the world is the honeybee. It's a social bee. It's a corbiculate apid because, like stingless bees, Trigona, Melipona, and bumblebees, has these little saddlebags, basically concave area with a fairly complex system of hairs, the corbicula, that holds wetted pollen. So honeybees typically collect the pollen and they will regurgitate nectar onto it and form this pellet, which grows very rapidly on the back of the bee. It's good for the bee because the bees are going there for food and it helps them not to waste pollen. Not so good for the plant. This pollen is actually out of commission in terms of pollination. It's wetted and it won't germinate. The pollen that is most important for pollination is the residual, maybe 1% or 1/100% of loose grains scattered around. But there's a really interesting kind of arms race between bees and plants. And so flowering plants have, through their evolutionary history, stuck pollen in places where bees can't reach to groom. So just like sometimes when you need a buddy to help scratch your back, you can't reach that place that itches, under the chin, proboscideal fossa, top of the head, between the leg bases, and a stripe along the back of the thorax, are areas where plants like to place pollen. That's the most important pollen for pollination. Ed went over this, and I'm not going to belabor the point. I'll only mention that angiosperms discovered something really cool over 100 million years ago. That is double fertilization. So when the pollen tube pops out of the pollen grain through one of the pores and travels all the way down here, there are sperm cells and a tube nucleus, and so part of these sex cells are involved with fertilizing the seed, causing the embryo, but the other one actually forms a triploid tissue, the endosperm, which becomes the food for the developing seedling. Okay, so we can meet some of our neighbors. One of my all-time favorites, along with Centris, is this Anthophora, which is a typical digger bee. And one important way that if you have a hand lens or a microscope to tell a bee from a wasp is that if you magnify the view somewhere on the body of the bee, with parasitic bees it's more difficult, but somewhere you will find these branched hairs. So it's almost like looking at the little barbules on the parts of a bird's feather. And these increase the surface area and help them snag the pollen. Another cool trick that bees will use is that just like a baseball, 767, a bee, anything that flies through the air acquires a very strong positive electrostatic charge. So you can actually have pollen grains jumping an air gap of several millimeters from flower to bee. It's totally passive, but bees are like flying paintbrushes. So they're actively collecting the pollen to feed the larvae and sometimes themselves. But sometimes you have electrostatics, which helps. Bees are largely vegan wasps. Look at most wasps and they're carnivorous. Bees, for the most part, with a few exceptions, there are some bees in South America that I've worked on called vulture bees, where their food is actually roadkill or animals that die someplace in the forest. But by and large, bees are feeding on nectar for their carbohydrates. It's mentioned before that it contains sugars, contains sucrose, glucose, and fructose, but it also has lipids, proteins, amino acids. But the pollen is the primary protein source. We've seen this one before. This is a local bee that's fairly famous. This is the world's smallest bee, heard of the minima. They can get down to as short as 1.5 millimeters. And these pollinate the little tiny mat euphors, Chemisorata, and a few others that you'll find coming up in the cracks of your sidewalk. I'm just going to go through a little bit of a bestiary to show you a few bees. There's a male long-horned bee. There are long-horned beetles, the cerambicids. So this is kind of the bee equivalent. That's a little sunflower bee, Melisodes. And over on the right-hand side, which blooms during our hot season, during June, one of our barrel cacti. And here are a whole pile of bees in the genus Idiomelisodes, which is an important pollinator of this plant. Our largest bees are either bumblebee queens or carpenter bees. Here's a carpenter bee on the right. My favorite little centrus up there on my finger. And then one of the little metallic green bees that Joe talked about that likes to live in the closet in this building. Some male bees are very, very territorial and will duke it out during the day. They're fighting for possession of mates or good flowers, whatever. But sometimes by night they will aggregate and be completely pacifists that sleep together at night. That's what's happening here in the summer with these little Auga chlorella bees. We mentioned a few of these before. Here's another quick look. A squash bee down here, and a squash blossom, centrus, Anthophora on a beard's tongue, a penstemon, honeybees, and a leafcutter bee. Ed mentioned one of the diagnostic characters for some of these bee families. One is the leafcutter bees, so that they carry the pollen home on the underside of their abdomen. Okay. And there are lots and lots of bees. Roughly 21,000 species of bees around the world, far more than all the other vertebrate groups individually. The vertebrate group that comes closest to having the highest biodiversity, species richness, are the fishes. All right, so I'm going to go through a few of these very quickly. There's a lot of data on these slides. I'm not going to go through all of it, but a lot of times in the spring, we have andrenids, and you can find these on willows. You can also find them sometimes on composites. It is a huge genus. Andrena has over 2,000 species. And they typically carry the pollen as a light dusting